Hello everyone! You're on the channel BL Story of Love, a channel that shows forbidden BL stories. This story is about a desperate Omega who came to work as a nanny for an uncontrollable set of quadruplets belonging to a rich alpha. Don't forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you don't miss new forbidden BL stories that are impossible to tear yourself away from. Write in the comments which city you're watching this video from. Chapter 1. The Job Posting with the Impossible. Salary Elias had long ago stopped thinking in years or even months. His future ended at the edge of the coming week. Beyond that, there was only fog. His life fit inside a small, damp room at the back of a peeling townhouse on the outskirts of the city. The wallpaper had once tried to be cheerful, but now it hung in loose strips. The smell of mold and old cooking oil never really left, no matter how often he opened the tiny crooked window. Behind the wall, a television yelled, children cried, someone laughed too loudly. That noise was the constant background to his days. By day he stood behind the steaming metal counter of a cheap cafe, sliding trays to strangers, hands smelling of dish soap and burnt coffee. At night he mopped silent office floors, pushing the bucket along long corridors that belonged to people who would never learn his name. Between one shift and the next, he counted crumpled bills and coins on his narrow bed, calculating how many days on could keep the rent paid and the lights on. His Omega ID lay in the top drawer, wrapped in an old envelope. On it, in thin, unfriendly letters, were printed words about fragile health, hormone instability, no registered partner. Employers glanced at that line, and suddenly all their smiles became distant, formal. "We will call you," they said, and of course they never did. The student loan he had once taken with trembling hope pressed on him like a weight tied to his chest. University had become a finished chapter he could no longer reopen. Between medical certificates, missed exams, and the brutal math of rent and food, reality had won. Doctors told him to avoid overwork and strong stress, as if that was a lifestyle choice. None of them explained how to follow that advice when the empty fridge stared back at him like an accusation. Chronic exhaustion clung to him the way damp clung to the walls. That morning, he sat in an overcrowded employment center on a plastic chair that rocked slightly every time someone walked past. The air tasted of cheap perfume, sweat, and printer toner. Numbers were called from an old loudspeaker, voices rising and falling in dull waves. Elias stared at the cracked screen of his phone, scrolling through listings. Night shifts, warehouse labor, courier work in any weather, the same offers he had seen 100 times. Low pay, high demands, the quiet insult of Omega candidates welcome, that in practice meant desperate enough to accept anything. His thumb almost slid right past the line that did not look like the rest. He blinked and scrolled back. The title was so out of place it seemed like a mistake. Nanny and childcare assistant, high pay, live-in, strict candidate screening. For a moment he simply looked at the words, waiting for the catch to jump out at him. The body of the ad was written in dry official language, but the details hooked his attention. Care for 4 children at once, a schedule described as almost around the clock with rest days by agreement. A separate room in the employer's house, meals provided, full medical coverage. It sounded like something from another world. Then he reached the last lines. The compensation. It was not written in bold, not highlighted, just sitting there, quiet and insane. The figure made his heart stutter. He reread it, slowly, as if his tired brain might have misread a digit that was not actually there. For a few months of this work, he could close most of the debt that haunted his sleep. For a few months of this work, he could move out of the rotting townhouse and into some place where walls did not crumble when you touched them. For a few months of this work, he could breathe without immediately calculating the price of that breath. Impossible, he whispered to himself. Then, after a second, too good. Below, in small print, was the shadow behind the bright promise. Previous candidates had not been suitable. High stress tolerance required, empathy and readiness to work with highly active children, experience with alpha households preferred. Between the lines, the message was clear. Others had tried and failed. 3 nannies had already come and gone, if the rumors he vaguely remembered were true. No one lasted. He imagined 4 children, wild and hurt and used to making adults run. He imagined a big house where doors closed softly, where voices echoed down wide corridors, where an Omega like him would always feel slightly out of place. He imagined an Alpha employer watching him with cool eyes, measuring every move. Still, his thumb hovered over the apply button. He could almost feel the weight of his debt pressing down between his shoulder blades, could hear in his head the landlord's voice reminding him of how understanding could end very quickly if a payment was late again. Worst case, they ignore me, he thought. Best case, he had no idea. Something beyond survival, maybe. Something he had not dared to define for a long time. He filled out the form with careful, slightly shaking fingers. Personal data, work history, that messy patchwork of short contracts and cash-in-hand jobs. There were gaps in the timeline where he simply disappeared from official records, months when his health crashed and he slipped out of the system to recover in silence. Those empty spaces looked bad on a screen. He knew it. He uploaded a scan of his medical card, listing his Omega status, his moderate hormone instability, the absence of serious genetic risk factors. In a small text box for additional information, he wrote that he had experience caring for children, helping his aunt with younger cousins, calming fevers, reading bedtime stories on a mattress on the floor. His words looked thin and inadequate next to the cold printed requirements. At the end of the form, his finger hesitated for one last heartbeat. Then he pressed send. The confirmation message flashed, simple and merciless. Application submitted. He told himself not to expect anything. Agencies like to collect Omega resumes like spare parts, just in case. He went to the cafe, tied on his apron, smiled at customers, wiped tables. The day stretched out, long and sticky. The answer arrived that evening, when he was back in his narrow room, sitting on the bed with a bowl of instant noodles. His phone vibrated once, then again. He almost ignored it, thinking it was another spam message about loans. Then he saw the subject line, invitation to interview. The email was polite, almost formal. They thanked him for his interest, informed him that his profile had been pre-selected, and invited him to a face-to-face meeting at a private residence on the hill above the city. The address made his pulse jump. He had seen it before, in glossy business news segments. A modern mansion of glass and stone, often used as a background when reporters spoke about one of the most powerful alpha entrepreneurs in the region. At the bottom of the message stood a name, Caden Hart. In this city, that name meant money, authority, and a kind of quiet, dangerous gravity. Companies rose and fell when he moved his attention. People joked that his shadow had its own bank account. Elias had heard his voice only once in a recorded interview, smooth and controlled. That voice had belonged to a different universe. Now that universe had sent him a neatly worded invitation. Elias sat for a long time with the phone in his hand, staring at the screen until the letters blurred. Somewhere under his ribs a knot began to tighten, cold and heavy. Working with children did not scare him. He knew how to wipe tears, to hold small bodies through a nightmare, to endure shouting and mess. It was the scale that terrified him. Alphas like Caden Hart did not live in the same reality as an Omega who counted coins at the end of the week. Their rules were different, their losses were louder, their anger could ruin more than a single life, but choices did not wait forever. His own options were brutally simple. He could keep sinking, slowly, predictably, into a debt pit he already knew too well. Or he could walk up a hill where 3 nannies had already failed, into a house where his scent and his presence might be tolerated only as long as he performed perfectly. He closed his eyes, exhaled once, and typed a short answer confirming the time. When he put the phone down, the room looked even smaller than before. On the day of the interview, Elias stood at the foot of the hill, his cheap shoes sinking slightly into the smooth gravel of the driveway. Above him, tall gates rose in a clean geometric line, metal and security glass, hiding everything behind them. Beyond that barrier began a territory that did not belong to his world. No sagging wires, no graffiti, no stray cats, only order. The security car rolled past him with a soft, expensive hum, tires whispering over the stones. The road that led up to the mansion snaked through a manicured park. Shrubs were clipped into precise shapes, trees spaced as if measured with a ruler. Even the fallen leaves seemed to lie on the ground in a controlled pattern, not in messy piles. Every detail here had been planned, bought, trimmed. When the gates opened with a quiet mechanical sigh, He felt the air change. The city noise stayed below, cut off as if by an invisible wall. Up here there was only the rustle of wind in the leaves, the distant splash of water from an unseen fountain, the faint smell of cut grass and something floral from the garden. A man in a dark, perfectly fitted suit was waiting near the entrance. His tie sat at a mathematically straight angle. His hair barely moved with the breeze. He introduced himself as the estate manager, his voice polite but cool. His eyes traveled over Elias in a fast practice scan. Worn but clean jacket, straight shoulders despite the cheap fabric, folder held too tightly in thin fingers. "Follow me," he said, and turned without waiting for a reply. Inside, the house was quiet but not dead. It was the quiet of a place built to contain a lot of life without ever letting it spill into chaos. Somewhere far off, a plate clinked. From the kitchen came the muffled rhythm of knives on a cutting board. A vacuum cleaner hummed on another floor. Footsteps crossed a corridor above them, quick and light, like someone small running and someone taller trying to catch up. Children, he thought, and his stomach fluttered. The floors under his feet were smooth and cold, polished stone that reflected light from tall windows. Walls held art that looked expensive and deliberately calm. No family photos in crooked frames, no toys under chairs. All traces of real life had been pushed into certain zones, out of sight of the formal spaces. As they walked down a long hallway, the manager began to speak, his tone as even as the rest of the house. He laid out the facts like items on a report. In this house lived quadruplets, children of one alpha, physically healthy, intelligent, but extremely energetic and emotionally unstable. Their mother had died in an accident a few years earlier. The word "died," the manager pronounced quickly, almost without breathing on it, as if it were something to step over. Since then, staff had carried most of the daily care. The first nanny, hired right after the tragedy, had not lasted a month. She left after admitting she could not handle the constant pressure. The second slipped on spilled paint during one of the children's games and broke her wrist. She refused to come back after her cast was removed. The third, according to a cleaner, was last seen at dawn, dragging a suitcase down the driveway with wild eyes, leaving her uniform in a crumpled heap on the back porch. Elias listened while trying to keep his own face neutral. The story was told in a flat, professional voice, but the details were sharp. Children who had lost their mother, living with a father who spent most of his time in offices and boardrooms, had learned the only effective language they knew: chaos, things hidden in impossible places. Important documents that vanished before key meetings, paint poured over white rugs, gadgets dropped into sinks or out of windows, nighttime escapes from their rooms, bare feet slapping against the floors. For anyone trying to hold the house together, this had become the new normal. "And Mr. Hart?" Elias asked quietly, surprising even himself with the question. The manager's mouth tightened by a fraction. "Very busy," he answered. "Strict but fair. He spends little time with the children. He provides for them and makes sure they have everything they need." Between those short phrases lay the rest. An alpha who knew how to build empires out of glass and concrete, but whose own children remained his most complicated, most unmanaged project. They stopped in front of a tall double door. When it opened, the air shifted again. The office they entered did not look like any room Elias had ever cleaned. One wide window took up most of the far wall, offering a sweeping view of the city that seemed almost unreal from this height. The desk in the center was large but not heavy. Sleek lines, dark wood, a surface clear except for neatly stacked folders, a laptop, and a single pen placed as if by precise measurement. No clutter, no sentimental objects. The chair behind the desk was empty. For a moment Elias stood there, conscious of the sound of his own breathing in the stillness. His reflection in the window glass looked small, out of place against the distant skyline. Then the side door opened, and Caden Hart walked in. The room seemed to contract around him. He was tall in the way that made the space feel slightly too small, shoulders straight under the dark fabric of his suit, movements controlled and economical. His hair was clipped short, his jaw cleanly shaved. His scent reached Elias a fraction of a second after he did, muted by expensive cologne, but unmistakably alpha, solid, weighty. Elias's throat went dry. Every instinct in his body told him to lower his gaze, to make himself smaller, to blend into the background the way he always did around dominant scents. Sit, Caden said simply, and the single word landed like a command, though his tone remained calm. The interview that followed did not resemble the rehearsed question lists Elias had prepared for. They did not talk only about his previous jobs or references. Caden asked how he handled lack of sleep, how he reacted to screaming, whether he had ever lost someone close, how he felt about children who might hate him on sight because they were tired of new faces. Children sometimes break things to see if someone will still stay, the alpha remarked at one point, almost to himself. Elias answered honestly, because lying felt pointless here. He admitted he had never worked with quadruplets, only with cousins in a cramped apartment where shouting was normal. He said he did not like conflict, but he did not run from it as quickly as he used to. He spoke about fear without using the word trauma, letting it hover between them. Caden listened with the stillness of a man used to receiving reports that cost people their careers. He watched Elias's posture, the way his fingers clenched on the folder, and then forced themselves to relax. It was not just about ticking boxes. He was measuring whether this Omega could stand in a house that had already chewed up and spat out 3 nannies, whether he would shatter or bend. When the conversation finally shifted to payment and conditions, Elias felt his heartbeat in his ears. Hearing the offer out loud made the numbers from the ad more real, more dangerous. With that salary, he could erase debts, move, start again. Yet, under every practical phrase, he heard another layer. In this house, no one came just for a while. Every person who crossed the threshold became part of a delicate, stressed system, and leaving it later would not be simple. "We do not need someone for a month," Caden said quietly. "The children have had enough of temporary people." The manager slid a contract across the desk. The trial period was written there in clear legal language. 2 weeks of living on site. 2 weeks to see if he could endure and if the children would accept him or reject him like the others. Elias looked at the clean black letters, then at the signature already placed at the bottom in a precise, confident hand. Caden Hart. The ink was dry, the decision from the alpha side already made. The empty line above caregiver waited for his name. His pen felt strangely heavy when he picked it up. Somewhere inside, beneath layers of fatigue and caution, something stirred. A feeling he had not trusted in a long time, a narrow, sharp thread of hope woven tightly with fear. "If I sign," he thought, "this place will not just be a job, it will be my whole life for a while." The thought scared him. The alternative scared him more. He wrote his name. The first meeting with the children felt less like an introduction and more like walking straight into a weather front. The manager stopped at the end of a bright corridor, knocked once out of habit, and then opened the door without waiting for a reply. "This is the playroom," he said, and stepped aside. Elias crossed the threshold and understood that the word playroom was far too soft. The floor was almost completely covered by a sprawling fortress built from cushions, cardboard boxes, and stolen blankets. It sprawled from one wall to the other, towers of pillows leaning at dangerous angles, tunnels made from chairs pushed together, a shaky bridge of couch cushions suspended between 2 low tables. Someone had drawn crooked flags on scraps of paper and taped them on top. One read, in unsteady letters, "No adults allowed." The walls bore scars from earlier battles. Marker streaks climbed up in jagged lines, bright reds and blues and greens that cleaning crews had only partially managed to erase. In one corner, a faded handprint, too small to be an adult's, remained high on the paint like a tiny, defiant signature. The air was thick with the smell of warm child skin, fruit juice that had dried on surfaces, the faint plastic scent of toys, and underneath all that, a thread of unease. Not fear exactly, but the restless, humming energy of beings who had learned that the world could change in an instant. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward him. The quadruplets froze for the briefest heartbeat as they registered a new adult in their territory. 3 boys and 1 girl, close enough in appearance to seem like reflections in a slightly distorted mirror. Same dark lashes, same angular chin, the same strange mixture of their father's sharpness, and a softer echo that must have belonged to their mother. Yet each carried that mix differently, like 4 variations on the same melody. One boy stood on a stool, stretched to his full height, fingers gripping the edge of a high shelf. He was balanced on his toes, thin legs trembling just enough to make Elias's stomach clench. His eyes flicked from the newcomer to the manager and back, measuring the level of danger. Another boy knelt in the heart of the pillow fortress, a disassembled toy car spread out in front of him like an autopsy. Small tools were scattered around his knees. He held one wheel in his hand, studying it with intense, almost adult concentration. The third sat closer to the door, pressed against the side of the couch, arms wrapped around a worn plush bear. The bear's fur was matted in places, one eye almost gone. The boy's fingers were white where they dug into the fabric. The girl occupied her own separate island of order amid the chaos. She sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by colored pencils, laid out in a near-perfect circle around her. In front of her lay a sheet of paper covered in lines that might have been a house or perhaps a storm, or both at once. For one suspended moment, the room held its breath. Then, the silence shattered. The boy on the stool gave a high, sharp yell and jumped down, landing harder than he meant to. His bare feet slapped the floor as he sprinted toward the far corner, disappearing behind a tall cabinet with the speed of a startled animal. A second later, a drawer banged open somewhere back there. The one kneeling in the fortress let out a wordless battle cry and launched himself forward, charging across the cushions straight at Elias. It was not an attack meant to hurt, it was an impact test. His small shoulder slammed into Elias's hip hard enough to rock him, and the boy looked up, waiting to see if the adult would snap. The bear clutcher did the opposite. His eyes widened, and he slid sideways along the couch, trying to make himself even smaller in the gap between the furniture and the wall. His chin tipped down, but his gaze never left Elias's shoes. The girl threw back her head and produced a sound that was almost operatic, an exaggerated wail that rose and fell. It was too loud for the small room, designed to bounce off the walls to see how long it would take before someone shouted at her to stop. "Enough," the manager said under his breath, but it had the weight of habit, not real force. Elias felt his heart slam against his ribs faster than usual, his muscles ready to move in every direction at once. All his instincts shrieked at him to restore order, to speak loudly, to set rules before the situation spun further out of control. That was what adults had done in the house where he grew up. Shouting had been the main tool, punishment the second. He held still instead. Years in a place where raised voices were constant had taught him that there was always a reason under the noise. Sometimes it was simple hunger or exhaustion or jealousy. Sometimes it was grief with no words. If he reacted only to the surface, he would see nothing underneath. So he watched. The boy who had been on the stool kept peeking out from behind the cabinet, checking whether anyone would order him down or drag him out. The girl's dramatic wailing faltered whenever her eyes flicked to the door, as if she, too, was waiting for that familiar command. Stop that, be quiet, behave. The child with the bear did not move from his corner. His knuckles stayed white, his shoulders tense, as if expecting at any moment that the fragile safety of his narrow space would be taken away. The manager cleared his throat and began a standard introduction, names and ages. But the children did not listen. They already knew the pattern. A new adult arrived, speaking gentle words, making promises, and then, when the house pushed too hard, they left. "This is the new nanny," the manager finished. "You will treat him with respect." Four little storms looked at Elias as if that word respect was a foreign language. The first days blurred into a strange mix of small victories and constant tests. The children treated him like weather, something to be checked for danger. Would this one flash and crack like lightning if they were too loud, or would he stay soft and distant like a cloud? They hid his things. His notebook, where he tried to plan meals and games, went missing, and later turned up inside a laundry basket under a pile of towels. His pen was discovered carefully taped to the underside of the dining table. A sock disappeared and reappeared stuffed into the pocket of a toy dinosaur. They drew on his notes. One afternoon, he returned from the kitchen to find his schedule covered in crooked suns and jagged storms, dark scribbles he recognized as attempts at names. His name was there, too, misspelled, written 3 times over like they were testing how it felt on paper. They poured water in places he had just cleaned, giggling as it spread, watching his face. They waited for that flash of anger, the heavy sigh, the accusation they had heard before. At night, the house changed shape. The wide corridors, so elegant in daylight, became long tunnels full of echoes. On the first night, he heard the patter of bare feet outside his room, the hiss of urgent whispers, a burst of muffled laughter cut off too quickly. They were running raids, he realized, quick charges past the door of the new adult to see if he would burst out and drag them back. He opened the door once, slowly, and found nobody there, only a dropped toy rolling lazily on the floor. Somewhere down the hall, a door clicked shut. He tried to build structure without turning it into a prison. Simple rituals, easy to remember. After dinner, they would gather in the playroom and choose one toy each to put back in its place. He made it a game, counting softly under his breath, praising any effort, even if the toy ended up in the wrong basket. Bedtime became a sequence of small signals. Lights dimmed gradually rather than all at once, curtains half drawn, not completely closing out the view. A short story, not about perfect families, but about brave animals or children who got lost and then found their way. It was easier to talk about fear when it wore fur or feathers. It was hard. His body ached in ways he had forgotten it could ache. Climbing stairs again and again, bending to lift small bodies, carrying one sleeping child while another clung to his sleeve. Some nights, when the house finally grew still, he collapsed onto his own bed and stared at the ceiling, feeling the old panic licking at the edge of his thoughts. Too much, he would think, just for a second. This is too much. Then he remembered the tiny hand that had reached for his earlier that night, fingers curling around his thumb, as if checking whether he was solid enough to hold on to. And something inside him hardened, not in the sense of closing, but like a spine he had forgotten he possessed, straightening up. He began to notice patterns the others might have missed. The children reacted differently to scents. When the sharp trace of Alpha passed through the hallway, even muted by cologne, their shoulders tightened. Eyes flicked to doors, waiting for orders or judgment. Voices dropped instinctively, as if rehearsing for inspection. When Elias entered a room, their bodies responded another way. His omega smell was soft, a mixture of worn cotton, soap, a hint of coffee from the kitchen. At first, they treated it with suspicion, but when nightmares sent them stumbling out of their rooms, it was his door they ended up at. They did not always knock. Sometimes a small shape simply leaned against the frame and slid down, half asleep on the floor. He would wake to the quiet pressure of presence and find a child curled there, breathing too fast. He never scolded. He just opened the door wider and let that small body climb under his blanket for a few minutes, until their heartbeat matched his. He did not think of what this would mean later, in terms of boundaries or contracts. In those moments, he thought only of warmth. He told no one about his observations. It felt too intimate, too vulnerable to say out loud that he suspected they remembered safety as a smell more than as a face. Maybe somewhere deep in their earliest memories, their mother's scent and the scent of an Omega caregiver had fused into a single signal. You are held. You are not alone. For himself, this quiet knowledge became a piece of ground. In a house ruled by schedules and expectations, he had something no contract could list as a skill. He could be a calm in their storm, not by force, but by being. On the evening of the first day, after he had finally coaxed the last child into sleep, Elias stepped out of the dim nursery and pulled the door almost closed, leaving it open just a crack. The corridor felt unusually long and empty. He turned and saw Caden standing at the far end, half in shadow. The Alpha's suit jacket was gone, his shirt sleeves rolled to his forearms. He was not making any sound, but he had clearly been there for a while, watching. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The distance between them was filled with unasked questions. Elias's hand still rested on the door handle, fingers careful not to rattle it. He thought of the fortress of pillows, of spilled juice, of the 4 small bodies finally breathing evenly in the darkened room. He thought of the contract in his drawer, of the line he had signed. Caden's gaze flicked to the crack of light at the edge of the nursery door, then back to Elias. There was something in his eyes that was not part of his public image, not the Alpha who controlled companies, but a man who had stood outside too many closed doors. "Did they sleep?" he asked softly. Elias nodded. "For now," he answered, his own voice barely above a whisper. It was not much, that exchange. 2 short lines floating in a hallway, but under them a fragile bridge began to form, connecting 4 little storms in one room, an Omega who refused to run at the first gust of wind, and an Alpha who was only just starting to admit how lost he was in his own house. The trial period was supposed to last only 7 days, but for Elias, each day stretched into its own small lifetime. Morning, midday, evening, night. Every cycle left marks on his body and on his thoughts, like rings on a tree. The house itself was built for control. He noticed it more with every passing hour. In the upper corners of hallways where shadows gathered, small black domes watched silently. In the playroom, a tiny lens was hidden in what looked like a motion sensor. In the kitchen, another eye sat above the doorway, angled just right to see who came and went. No one explained the cameras to him. They did not need to. The manager had casually mentioned on the first day that the live feeds went straight to his own office and to Caden's private study. For safety, he had said. The word was true, but incomplete. The children probably had never been told that they were under surveillance. Still, they behaved like creatures who had grown up under a constant, invisible gaze. When they were alone with Elias, their play loosened, became louder, wilder. But sometimes, in the middle of a game, one of them would glance up briefly to a corner of the ceiling, eyes narrowing as if checking whether the unseen watcher was still there. Elias felt the lenses on his back, too. At first it made him stiff, his movements careful, almost rehearsed, as if he were acting out the role of good nanny in a play that could be paused and rewound at any time. But children did not respond to performances. They reacted to the smallest cracks where real feelings came through. So he forced himself to breathe, to let his shoulders drop, to act as if the only eyes that mattered were the 4 pairs in front of him. Mornings began as chaos and slowly, painfully, started to resemble a sequence. On the first day, getting them out of bed was like trying to gather 4 different storms into one bottle. One child went limp, pretending to be asleep. Another ran down the hallway in his pajamas, shouting a song at the top of his lungs. The third refused to leave the bathroom once he got in, fascinated by the foam on his hands. The girl sat on her bed and watched Elias with a carefully blank expression, as if waiting to see what kind of adult he would be at dawn. By the 3rd morning, he had a plan. He made teeth brushing into a song, quietly humming the same simple melody every time they stood at the sink. At first they rolled their eyes, but little by little, the familiarity of the tune began to guide them through the steps. For breakfast, he turned eating into a game of colors. Today, he would say, laying plates down, we need at least 1 green, 1 orange, and 1 white on each plate. Then the plate wins. It was a silly rule. It also meant they took at least a bite of vegetables, fruit, and something simple like bread or rice. They frowned, argued over what counted as orange, but they tried. When someone began to spiral into an outburst, he added a touch instead of a scolding. A soft hand on a shoulder, a gentle, steady pressure between the shoulder blades, a quiet, "I see you," spoken so low the camera's microphones might not catch it. Often, that was enough to stop the scream from reaching full volume. Sometimes it was not, and then he just stayed, not flinching, until the wave passed. The staff observed all this with a mixture of curiosity and exhaustion. The cleaners, the cook, the security guards had already seen other nannies arrive with charts and schedules, reward systems, and carefully planned activities. Those women had come armed with perfect references and certificates, with books on child psychology and firm voices. In any other house, they might have been ideal. Here, their systems had cracked on contact with raw grief and restless energy. The house seemed to reject anything that felt too rigid, as if it were a living organism that spat out foreign bodies. Elias did not bring many theories with him. Mostly, he brought his own history of being a child in a place where adults preferred rules to understanding. He did not talk about that, but it shaped the way he moved. He knew how to recognize the look in a child's eyes that meant, "I'm about to break something just to make sure you are real." The staff saw that he did not shout when milk spilled. He crouched and handed a cloth to the guilty hand, saying only, "Help me." They saw that when a toy was thrown in anger, he picked it up later and placed it somewhere visible, instead of locking it away as punishment. To them, it looked naive. "He will not last," one of the older cleaners murmured in the kitchen one afternoon, shaking her head. They all start soft. Maybe she was right. But for now, the children were watching him with new eyes. Caden himself remained mostly a presence at the edge of the frame. Over the course of that week, Elias rarely saw him directly for more than a minute or two. The alpha left early, returned late. His footsteps in the hallway were different from everyone else's, measured, heavy enough that the floor seemed to prepare for them. Sometimes Elias caught his silhouette at the end of the corridor. A tall shape paused for a breathless second as laughter spilled out of the open playroom door. The alpha would stand there, just outside the light, paying more attention than his schedule allowed. When the children laughed together, sharp and bright, Elias saw his face soften slightly, the tight lines around his mouth easing. When a sudden wail broke the air, when someone fell or a fight broke out, Caden's eyes darkened, his whole body tightening before he turned away, trusting the staff to handle it, or not trusting himself to step in. The cameras did the rest. In the study, where city lights glittered beyond the glass wall, one of the screens on Caden's desk often showed the playroom. Sometimes he watched the feed with the same focus he gave financial reports. He saw Elias kneeling to tie a shoelace, carrying 2 children at once, sitting on the floor with his back against the couch, and a sleeping boy draped across his lap like a heavy blanket. It was a strange kind of intimacy, one way and silent. One evening, after the children had finally surrendered to sleep, the manager sought Elias out as he was rinsing small cups in the kitchen sink. "Mr. Hart asked me to tell you something," he said. Elias straightened, heart kicking up. Praise meant risk, criticism meant risk, silence meant risk. Everything did. "Continue," the manager quoted, his tone neutral. "That is all. Just one word. No compliment, no list of approved and disapproved actions. Yet for someone who had spent years being invisible in other people's spaces, it felt like the nearest thing to acknowledgement he had received in a long time." Inside, another process was unfolding quietly. The more hours he spent in the house, the more his original simple goal began to blur. He had come to the Hart estate as a man who desperately needed money and a solid roof. The contract was his lifeline, a way out of a future that ended in overdue rent notices and debt collectors. But every night, when he sat cross-legged on the playroom floor with 4 small bodies slowly collapsing around him, his motivation shifted by a degree he could not ignore. One boy would fall asleep with his head pressed against Elias's thigh, another sprawled half across his feet, the girl curled like a cat under his arm, the last one clutching his hand even in dreams. He started to picture a future that included them, not just as a temporary job, but as a line that might continue. It was a dangerous thought. He pushed it away, and it returned, stubborn as a child asking the same question again and again. Anxiety did not vanish with routine. If anything, it grew sharper as he cared more. He knew too many stories about omegas who had built entire worlds around children only to be cut out of their lives with a signature when an alpha decided it was time for a more appropriate arrangement. In this society, legal rights clung to bloodlines and money, not to the person who sat beside a bed through a fever. In the nightstand drawer of his room lay the contract. The pages clearly mapped his duties, his schedule, his salary. His rights were shorter, a list of things he could expect as long as the agreement lasted, and a reminder that the agreement could be ended. And yet, the living warmth of a child pressed against his side did not fit into any of those clauses. The way one of the boys mumbled his name into a pillow before sleep did not exist on paper. The quiet trust in the girl's eyes when she handed him a broken toy, expecting him to fix it, was not something a camera could fully capture. At the end of the 7th day, when evening folded itself around the hill and the city lights flickered on below, the manager came to him again. "Mr. Hart would like to see you in his office," he said. The walk down the now familiar corridor felt longer than it had that first day. Elias's body remembered every step taken that week, every night spent half awake listening for small feet on the floor. His mind replayed moments he feared might be judged mistakes. The time he let them draw on cardboard instead of stopping them immediately. The evening he allowed an extra story because one of them had looked particularly fragile. The office was the same as before, all straight lines and cool surfaces, the wide window framing the city like a painting. Caden stood beside the desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled, as if he had only just paused in the middle of work. The conversation was brief. The decision had already been made before Elias walked in. The trial was over. They would extend a permanent contract, not just as a live-in nanny, but as a regular presence in the children's upbringing, someone the house would adapt around, not just plug in temporarily. Caden did not dress it in pretty words. He stated terms, expectations, boundaries, but the essential fact was simple. Elias was staying. When Elias stepped back into the corridor with the new contract in his hand, the paper felt heavier than it should have. He knew on one level that he had just secured an income that could steady his life. On another, deeper level, it felt as if he had boarded a train without fully knowing where it was headed. It was not just a job anymore. It was a ticket into a life whose rules he did not yet understand. In a house where cameras recorded his every move, 4 children had already begun to claim pieces of his heart, and an alpha watched from behind glass, deciding who would be allowed to stay close to them. Permanent work in the Hart house did not just mean a steady paycheck. It meant waking up every day inside a place where every emotion rippled outward and hit everyone else. On good days, the mansion felt like it was breathing with them. On bad days, it felt like a closed system, amplifying every shout, every slammed door, every sharp inhale of fear. The children did not stop testing Elias just because he had stayed a week. They simply changed the shape of their tests. The open rebellions of the first days softened into subtler challenges, sudden tantrums that came out of nowhere, right in the middle of a calm game, refusals to follow routines they had already accepted, disappearing acts that turned hide-and-seek into something closer to a search and rescue drill. One afternoon, the storm hit in 3 directions at once. It began with a door slamming somewhere down the service hallway. Elias turned his head and realized with a chill that one of the boys was missing from the kitchen table. Bare feet had vanished along with a half-finished glass of juice. A second later, he heard the faint scrape of a lock turning. By the time he reached the hallway, the pantry door was closed from the inside. Small fists thumped once against wood, then went quiet. The house seemed to hold its breath. At the same moment, the other 2 boys decided the upstairs corridor was a racetrack. They tore down it in opposite directions, shrieking with wild laughter, small hands dragging along the walls, knocking picture frames askew. The girl, who had been watching everything with that too old gaze of hers, walked calmly to the middle of the kitchen, took a bag of dry grains from the counter, opened it with careful fingers, and began to pour. Yellow and brown cascades rained onto the floor, handful after handful, until the tiles were covered in shifting patterns, like a strange map. She moved her hand back and forth, drawing invisible shapes with the falling grains, jaw set in stubborn concentration. Any other adult might have snapped in that moment. Elias felt the panic rise, fast, starting somewhere under his ribs and racing up toward his throat. He could see the disaster from every angle, a child closed in a dark space, 2 others seconds away from falling down the stairs, a 4th about to slip on the mess she was creating. His body wanted to react the way it had been trained to in his childhood home. Raise his voice, shout commands, use fear to freeze everyone in place. He closed his eyes for half a heartbeat and remembered another night, many years earlier. A small version of himself sitting on a cold floor in a narrow hallway, listening to adults argue behind a closed door, knowing better than to knock. The heavy feeling of being completely alone with his fear. He refused to put them there. He started with the most vulnerable point, the girl on the kitchen floor. Elias went to her and crouched down, not touching her, not grabbing the bag from her hands. The grains continued to spill, piling around their knees. "It is a lot," he said quietly, more an observation than a scolding. Her shoulders tensed. For a moment he thought she would throw the bag at him. Instead, she looked sideways at his face, checking for anger. There was none. Only presence. He stayed there, breathing slowly, letting his calm be something she could lean against if she wanted to. Her movements slowed. The handfuls became smaller, the lines she drew with the grains more hesitant. Finally, she let the empty bag drop and pressed her palms flat on the floor, fingers digging into the mess she had made. Her lower lip trembled, as if she were about to cry or bite someone, and then the tightness in her eyes eased just a fraction. I will help you clean this later, he said. Not now. Leaving her there, not abandoned but not forced into instant repair, he walked to the pantry. The door handle was still turned to the locked position. He could hear small, quick breaths on the other side, the rustle of fabric, a muffled sniff. He did not bang on the door. He did not threaten or promise. He leaned his forehead gently against the wood and spoke in a low, steady voice. I am here, he said. You are not in trouble. I will not leave. Open when you are ready. Silence stretched out, long enough for doubt to start whispering in his ear. Then there was a shift, the soft scrape of a small body moving. The lock clicked, sharp in the quiet hallway. The door opened a few centimeters, then a little more. A pale face appeared in the gap, blotchy around the eyes. Elias stepped back just enough to give space instead of crowding him. The boy stared, waiting for the explosion that never came. When it did not arrive, his shoulders dropped and he stepped out, pressing himself briefly against Elias's side, like someone checking that a wall was really solid. Upstairs, the race turned into a chase that threatened to spiral. By the time Elias reached the corridor, one boy was halfway up on the banister, laughing and wobbling. For a moment, Elias's heart stopped. He pictured broken bones, hospital lights, the look on Caden's face. He did not shout. He walked forward with deliberate slowness, holding out his arms. Come down, he said, voice firm but even. My turn to be fast, not yours. Something in his tone cut through the wildness. The boy slid down, landing in front of him, breathing hard, eyes bright. Elias scooped him up, feeling the wiry weight of the child, and carried him back toward the bedroom, the other trailing behind, their earlier manic energy dissolving into the usual post-chaos drowsiness. No report would ever list this sequence. There would be no entry in any official file that read, 1 pantry crisis diffused, 1 near fall avoided, 1 quiet exit from a storm of grains. But somewhere in the private geography of the children's minds, new markers appeared. This adult did not disappear when things got messy. He did not turn into a shouting wall when they screamed. He stayed. In their internal compass, where people were mapped as safe, dangerous, or temporary, a new category was forming. Someone you could come back to without being punished for having run away in the first place. The staff noticed different things. They saw that Elias did not ask for special treatment after difficult days. He did not complain about late hours or demand time off every time a night went bad. His few belongings stayed in the same corner of his room. He never packed them halfway, never lined his shoes at the door as if ready to bolt. They remembered how the 3 previous nannies had left. One had quit after a single night of being woken repeatedly, her nerves shredded by the constant fear of someone falling down the stairs. Another had burst into tears in the kitchen after being told to control them better and walked out before the end of the week. The last one had simply vanished before breakfast, leaving her keys on the table beside an untouched cup of coffee. Elias came close to joining them once. It was a night when everything seemed to unravel at once. A storm rolled over the hill, thunder cracking too close, lightning flashing white against the windows. The children woke in waves, fear blooming in their small bodies like bruises. One screamed until his voice broke. Another ran down the hallway so fast he crashed into a cabinet. The girl crawled under her bed and refused to come out. By the time the house was quiet again, it was almost 4 in the morning. Elias found himself sitting on the floor in the upstairs corridor, back pressed against the wall, legs stretched out, 2 sleeping children slumped across his lap like warm, heavy sacks. His arms trembled from holding them, his eyes burned. The word "I quit" hovered at the back of his throat like a stone. He imagined going to his room, stuffing his few clothes into a bag, leaving the contract on the desk, with a short, apologetic note. He could picture the early light on the driveway as he walked down the hill, the taste of freedom mixed with defeat. He also pictured something else. A narrow room with thin walls, a younger version of himself sitting on a mattress, biting his knuckles to stay quiet while the adults ignored his shaking. The crushing knowledge that no one was coming to check on him, no matter how afraid he was. If he walked away now, he would be the adult who did the same to these children. The thought hit him with unexpected force. It did not feel noble. It felt like facing a version of himself he refused to become. Very slowly, he let his head rest back against the wall and exhaled. I am not running, he whispered into the empty corridor, too low for any camera microphone to catch. He stayed there until dawn, until the children's breathing deepened and their bodies grew heavier with true sleep. Only then did he carefully carry them back to their beds, one by one, and shuffle to his own room, collapsing without even taking off his clothes. Caden watched all this from a distance that was not as distant as it seemed. The feeds from the cameras showed him an Omega who flinched when a door slammed, whose shoulders jerked at sudden loud noises, whose face sometimes briefly flashed with his own old fear, but who did not let that fear dictate his actions. On the Alpha's desk lay contracts, risk assessments, projections. In his life, most people clung to his world for money, access, power. They negotiated, bargained, calculated. They left when the cost outweighed the gain. Here was someone who, on a night when any rational person would have packed and fled, chose to sit in a dim hallway with 2 children on his lap and fight only with himself. He stayed, not because of the salary written on paper, but because of a decision he had made somewhere far deeper. For a man used to controlled risks, that kind of stubborn, quiet loyalty was rare. And in a house built on losses in glass, Caden began to understand that this rare thing might be the only foundation strong enough to hold the 4 small storms growing under his roof. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that blurred into others. Toys scattered across the hallway like debris after a small personal storm, crayons rolling under furniture, building blocks abandoned mid-tower. Elias moved along the corridor with a basket in his hands, bending, lifting, trying to restore some kind of path through the chaos before someone tripped. At the far end of the hallway, past the children's bedrooms and the linen closet, stood a door he had never had reason to touch. It was painted the same soft shade as the wall, the handle simple and unadorned. Nothing about it called attention to itself, and yet it pulled at the eye. He realized, with a small jolt, that neither the children nor the staff ever came close to it. The housemaids, who vacuumed every corner, somehow always turned away a step earlier. The children, who had turned most of the mansion into their battlefield, slowed their running here, as if an invisible border cut across the floor. Their voices dropped when they passed it. Today, as he approached with the toy basket, one of the boys, usually the boldest explorer, veered off to avoid the last few meters of hallway. His feet skidded, his hand grabbed Elias's sleeve for balance, and for a second, his gaze flicked to the door. Not casual, not curious. Wary, Elias set the basket down and watched. Later, when the others had drifted to the playroom, the girl came padding down the corridor with a drawing clutched in her hand. She stopped opposite the door and stood there, thin shoulders tight, eyes fixed on the handle like it was an animal that might suddenly move. He had seen children look at forbidden cookie jars with mischief. This was not that. This was something heavier. "Do not touch that one," a cleaner said quickly as she passed with a laundry cart, her voice sharper than usual. The girl turned her head. "What is there?" she asked. For a heartbeat, the cleaner seemed to search for a better answer. None came. "The past," she muttered, half to herself. "You are not allowed in." Then she pushed the cart away, rattling more loudly than necessary, as if to drown her own words. The sentence hung in the air long after she left. The past. You are not allowed in. Children had their own logic. Tell them there is nothing interesting behind a door, and they will forget it. Tell them they cannot go because of something nameless and important, and the door becomes a magnet. In the days that followed, Elias began to notice a pattern. Some tantrums did not start in the playroom or the dining room, but here, in this long stretch of hallway. A child would pause in front of the locked door, stare at it for a beat too long, and then explode over something small. A refused snack, a misplaced toy. The trigger was trivial, the origin was not. It was as if their anger needed somewhere to go, and the sealed wood reminded them of everything that had never been explained. He did not touch the handle. The unspoken rules of the house were clear enough, even without words. Still, the presence of the door sat in the back of his mind, like a stone he kept forgetting until he stepped on it again. One quiet day, when the children were out in the garden with security, chasing each other around trees and shrieking at sprinklers, the manager asked Elias to come to the office. The sunlight in that room was different from the rest of the house, filtered through high windows that made the view of the city look distant and unreal. On the desk, besides the usual neat stacks of folders, lay several photographs. They were not framed, just placed on the polished wood like documents waiting to be reviewed. Elias approached and saw, for the first time, the Hart family as it had existed before the absence carved its place. In one photo, a young woman with warm eyes sat on a picnic blanket, two of the children in her lap, their chubby hands squishing her cheeks. Her smile was open, teeth showing, head tilted back slightly as if she'd been caught mid-laugh. The other two kids were half falling into the frame from either side, reaching toward her hair, toward one another, toward the camera. In another picture, all six of them stood in a row in front of a window, each wearing the same simple white t-shirt. Across every chest, from the smallest to the tallest, one word was printed in bold letters: team. The children in the photos were a little younger, softer around the edges, but unmistakably the same ones who now ran through the halls leaving Lego underfoot. The man in the picture was Caden, but not the version Elias passed in dark suits and tense silence. This Caden had his arms full of kids, one perched on his hip, another on his shoulders, his hair pulled slightly out of place by small fingers. He looked a little tired, and a lot alive. The manager spoke in short, factual sentences. There was no drama in his tone, only a dry kind of respect. The mother had died in a car accident. It had been raining hard, the roads slick. She was returning from a trip connected to one of her charity projects. The vehicle had skidded, left the highway, and gone down an embankment. She died before the ambulance arrived. The children had been elsewhere, under the care of a nanny, safe in body. Not safe from the echo that loss left in their lives. No one, the manager admitted, had really helped them carry that echo, not properly. Therapists had been consulted, assessments made, but daily life quickly swallowed those efforts. Caden had thrown himself into work with an almost manic focus, trying to keep the business from crumbling under the weight of his grief. The house, meanwhile, had grown quieter in some places and louder in others. One part of it had been frozen. The locked room at the end of the corridor, the manager said finally, confirming what Elias already suspected. That was her bedroom. He described it in brief strokes. Everything was left almost exactly as it had been the last day she walked out. Books on the nightstand, a dress over the back of a chair, a pair of earrings in a small dish. Toys the children had dragged in and not yet taken away. For Caden, that room had become the only corner of his world where time had not moved forward. A private museum he rarely entered but could not bring himself to dismantle. For the staff, it was sacred ground. For the children, it was a dark spot on the map of their home where all paths bent away. No one had told them clearly what it held. They only knew that something of their mother was behind that door, and that every adult seemed afraid of it. Listening, Elias felt a dull ache spread through his chest, as if someone had pressed a thumb into an old bruise. He imagined 4 small children in the months after the funeral, walking past the closed door again and again, sensing the fear in the grown-ups' shoulders, learning that some questions were not allowed. He understood something else, too. As long as that part of the house remained forbidden, the children would keep circling it in their minds. They would test the boundary in other ways, push against other walls because the one they really wanted to touch had been declared untouchable. A dangerous thought formed in him. What if someone opened it for them, not to satisfy his own curiosity? The idea of stepping into a stranger's preserved grief did not appeal to him, but to take some of the poison out of the air, to turn the door from a symbol of nameless horror into a place with dust and sunlight and ordinary objects. He did not say it aloud. He knew what the answer would be if he did. Rules had been built around that room, layer by layer, over years. A single Omega, newly installed in the hierarchy of the house, was not going to be the one to rewrite them, yet the thought would not leave. That evening they walked down the corridor after baths, 4 damp heads smelling of shampoo, pajamas slightly too big in places. As always, the children's chatter thinned as they approached the far end. One of the boys sped up, clearly wanting to get past faster. Another lagged, looking sideways at the door, his mouth pressed in a thin line. The girl stopped. She did not say anything. She only stood there, eyes fixed on the wood as if she could will it to become transparent. In her gaze, Elias saw not only curiosity, but a sharp, clean grief that was too much for such a small face. He watched her swallow it down, because no adult had given her any other way to carry it. In that moment, he understood that the locked room was not just part of Caden's coping mechanism. It was a wound for the children, kept open by silence. The key to that door, he knew, hung somewhere in the house. He had seen it once, among a ring of others in the manager's hand when locks were checked at night. He walked the rest of the way to the bedrooms with the children, reading them a story, tucking blankets around restless legs. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, a line had been crossed. The knowledge that the forbidden room hurt them more than their loudest games ever did sat inside him like a slow fire, quietly burning away at his obedience to unspoken rules. The decision to open that room did not come to Elias in one heroic moment. It formed slowly, like a crack spreading through glass. Every time he walked the upstairs corridor and saw the children's eyes snag on the locked door, the crack widened a little. His contract was clear. He had no right to invade private areas of the house, no right to touch what belonged to the family's inner life. That line had been drawn long before he arrived. Crossing it meant more than breaking a rule. It meant betraying the trust of the man who signed his paychecks, yet his instincts whispered something else. Each time a child's tantrum began after a silent confrontation with the door, each time the girl turned her face away from it as if from a painful light, he felt the weight of that silence. To keep walking past, pretending not to notice, felt less and less like loyalty and more like complicity. One day the house slipped into a rare state of loosened control. Caden left early for an important meeting, a brief nod at the door serving as both goodbye and unspoken reminder to keep everything in order. The manager spent the morning arranging details for an evening reception, his attention wrapped up in catering schedules and security lists. The staff moved through the lower floors, polishing, setting, preparing. Upstairs, for a short window of time, only Elias and the children occupied the corridor with the locked room. They played there because the corridor was long and bright, a perfect runway for toy cars and small races. The children's path, as it so often did, curved gradually toward the forbidden door, not by conscious choice, but by gravitational pull. One of the boys, the one who usually pretended not to care, reached out as he ran past and brushed his fingers over the handle. The contact was brief, but he jerked his hand back as if the metal had burned him. His face twisted, not from pain, but from something like guilt. Elias watched that flinch and felt something in him finally give way. He knew where the key was. He had seen it on the manager's ring, had noticed how the older man's hand tightened around it whenever he checked the upstairs locks. Keys told their own stories, and this one was guarded more tightly than the others. Earlier that morning, when helping the manager sort through a small toolbox, Elias had seen the ring lying for once on the table, not on a belt. His fingers had hovered over it, then withdrawn. Later, when the room was empty, he had gone back. The key he slipped into his pocket was small, ordinary, its metal cool against his palm. It felt heavier than it should. Now he stood in front of the locked door with 4 children behind him, their breathing quick and uneven. His heart pounded loud enough that he wondered if they could hear it. Every line of his contract flashed through his mind, every warning about boundaries, every half-smiled reminder that this was just a job. He thought of the girl's face when she stared at the door. He chose. With hands that looked steadier than he felt, Elias took the key from his pocket and slid it into the lock. The tiny click as it turned seemed absurdly loud in the quiet hallway. The children went absolutely still. Even the air felt like it held its breath. For them, this was not just a door opening. It was the sound of a sealed part of their mind being cracked, a secret universe within their own house being made real. The latch released with a soft, reluctant thud. Elias pushed gently. The door moved inward, protesting with a long, low creak. A thin draft slipped out, bringing with it the smell of stale air and something else, faint but stubborn. A trace of perfume sunk so deep into fabrics that the house had never managed to scrub it out. Inside, time had stopped. Dust lay gently over everything, softening edges, blurring colors. The bed was made, but not with the crisp hotel-perfect corners of the rest of the house. The blanket was slightly rumpled, as if someone had risen in a hurry and meant to fix it later. A book lay open on the bedside table, face down, a ribbon of paper marking a place which would never be read again. There were photos on the dresser, the same faces Elias had seen in the office prints, but closer, intimate. One showed the mother laughing with her head thrown back, hair messy, a child's hand caught in the middle of tugging it. Another was of a tiny palm pressed to an adult cheek, clothes still hung in the wardrobe. A dress draped over a chair waited for shoulders that would not return. On the nightstand, a small dish held rings and a pair of earrings, as patient as if their owner might walk in at any moment and slip them on. The children stepped over the threshold not like raiders, but like pilgrims, slowly, hesitantly, as if expecting the floor to vanish under them. The girl moved first, drawn toward the bed. She reached out and let her fingers rest on the cover, stroking the fabric as if it might purr. Her jaw clenched, then loosened. One of the boys went to the nightstand and picked up a framed photograph with both hands. In it, he was younger, cheeks rounder, nestled against his mother's chest while she smiled at the camera. He stared at the picture, then at the space where her body had once been, trying to reconcile the two. Another child went to the open wardrobe and pressed his face briefly against a hanging jacket, inhaling. When he turned around, there was a wild, naked grief in his expression that almost knocked Elias back a step. Questions began to spill out, low at first, then tumbling over each other. Where is she? Why did she not come back? Did it hurt? What did she smell like? Did she ever sleep in this bed with all of us? Elias answered as honestly as he could, without overstepping what he knew. He told them she had loved them so much it almost showed in the paint on the walls. He explained, as gently as possible, that the accident had been sudden, that nothing they had done could have caused it. He did not lie and say it had not hurt, but he framed the pain as brief against the long echo of their lives. He did not tell them to stop touching things. He did not herd them out after a token minute. He stood nearby, silently anchoring the moment with his presence, letting them map the room with their own eyes and hands. For the first time, their mother was not just a word adults swallowed around or a blurry face in a photo high on a wall. She was a woman who had read these books, worn these clothes, dropped that earring on the floor, and forgotten to pick it up. A real person, not a ghost behind a locked door. They did not notice the sound of a car in the driveway. They did not hear footsteps climbing the stairs, heavier than usual. Caden arrived home earlier than expected. He came down the corridor with his mind full of meetings, numbers, threats dressed as offers. When he saw the door standing open, the world narrowed to a single point. For a second, his body simply stopped, as if his nerves had short-circuited. Then he moved. He stepped into the doorway and took in the scene in one brutal sweep. The dust disturbed, the children scattered through the room, Elias standing among them with the air of someone who knew he had crossed an invisible line and chosen not to step back. Caden's face went pale, then flushed with color. Rage rose first, sharp and bright. The one sanctuary he had kept intact, the one place he had not allowed time to touch, had been breached without his consent. "What have you done?" he said, and the words cut the air like glass. Elias heard the rule he had broken in that voice: trespassing, disrespect for boundaries. He also heard another note, buried under the anger, sheer, unmasked terror. Terror that his children were seeing the raw outline of his grief, the room where he stored the life he had failed to keep. The accusations came then, in controlled, cold phrases. "You violated the contract. You entered private space. You exposed the children to things they were not ready for." Each sentence built a wall between them, brick by careful brick. Elias listened, standing very still. He did not defend himself with theory. He did not try to hide behind the children. Inside, his own fear roared. He had likely just destroyed his position in this house, maybe his ability to send money to pay off his debts, to keep a roof over his head. But when he closed his eyes, even for a heartbeat, he did not see Caden's anger. He saw the girl's hand on the blanket, the way her shoulders had finally dropped, as if a knot inside her had loosened for the first time in years. He said only quietly, "They needed to see she was real." That did not lessen the fury in the alpha's gaze. If anything, it made it more complicated. That night, lying awake in his small room, listening to the slow spread of silence through the house, Elias understood exactly how precarious his position had become. One decision, rooted in instinct and love, had put his job, his shelter, his future here under direct threat. Fear pressed heavy on his chest, whispering that he had been a fool, that people like him could not afford such risks. And yet, when his mind tried to replay the scene in the bedroom, it always paused on the same image. Not Caden in the doorway, not his own shaking hands on the key, but the look in the little girl's eyes as she stared at her mother's photograph instead of at a closed door. For the first time, pain there was not twisted by confusion. It was clear, clean, named. Between rules and love, he had stepped onto a blade-thin line. He did not know yet whether it would cut him to pieces or hold his weight. Stories born behind tall gates rarely stayed there, especially when the gates belonged to a man like Caden Hart. A few days after the incident with the locked room, the first crack appeared in the form of a short article on an entertainment portal. The headline spoke of chaos in the home of a famous alpha who could manage corporations but not his own children. The text hinted at unresolved grief, wild quadruplets, and a new Omega nanny who blurs boundaries in a house that already bleeds. The source, of course, was unnamed, but the details betrayed someone from the lower rungs of the staff ladder, recently let go during cost cuts. The writer did not need access to the interior. Rumor was enough. There were descriptions of forbidden rooms and children roaming unsupervised, of an Omega who acts more like a family member than hired help. It was all vague enough to be unprovable and sharp enough to cut. 2 grainy photographs accompanied the article, taken from outside the estate. In one, the children rode their bikes in the driveway, hair flying, guards just out of frame. Another caught the moment when Elias lifted the girl into his arms to adjust her helmet. In the blown-up image, his face looked softer than he ever allowed it inside the house, the child's arms tight around his neck. The comments poured in like sour rain. Some users clucked their tongues in public sympathy for the orphans. Others turned on Caden, accusing him of coldness, of using work as an excuse to avoid parenting. A third group dissected the presence of an Omega in such a crucial role. Words like dangerous, unprofessional, and inappropriate appeared with uncomfortable regularity. The house did not smell the article, but everyone inside felt it. Phones buzzed, screens lit up. Somewhere in the background, televisions murmured about a powerful figure under scrutiny for his private life. The taste of the air shifted, like too much coffee and not enough sleep. For Caden, the piece was not just gossip. It was an assault on the one thing he still believed he could manage: his image. In the next board meeting, polite phrases hid firm pressure. Someone mentioned, with a practiced smile, that family issues had begun to shade the company's brand. A partner suggested, more bluntly, that investors preferred leaders whose homes looked as orderly as their balance sheets. "You need to restore discipline," one advisor said. "Bring in a structured team, no more experiments. In other words, fix the optics. Make the house look like a brochure again." Elias felt the change before anyone spoke to him directly. The rules tightened like a belt pulled one notch too far. The manager began to check in more frequently, not with open suspicion, but with the clipped politeness of someone now forced to report every detail. Any new game Elias proposed, any small adjustment to routine, now had to be cleared. Suggestions he would once have implemented quietly were redirected through layers of approval. In hallway conversations, staff voices dropped when he approached, then rose again as he passed. No one mentioned the article to his face, but everyone wore the thin, sharp scent of unease. The children reacted as they always did to adult tension. They absorbed it and turned it into storms. Their tempers shortened. They flinched more often at the sound of their father's voice on the phone, sensing the strain under his even tone. When the news played in the background and his name flickered on the screen, they looked at each other with that wary, wordless understanding children shared. Something is wrong with us, but no one will explain. School, which had recently entered their lives in the form of preparatory classes, became another arena. In the small cloakroom, where parents gathered and perfumes mixed with the rubber smell of boots, someone left a printed copy of the article on a low table, folded so the picture of the children was visible. Adults pretended not to see who had placed it there. The quadruplets could not yet read complex sentences, but they recognized their own faces. They also recognized the shift in the other parent's sense and glances. A little more pity here, a little more disapproval there. The buzz of whispers followed them down the hall. They might not have understood the words, but they understood that something about their home had become public property. The breaking point came in the schoolyard. A boy from another family, emboldened by the murmurs he overheard at home, tossed a remark at the girl about her crazy house and Omega mommy. The words were clumsy, but the tone was sharp. One of her brothers saw her freeze, saw the way her small shoulders tensed, and something in him snapped. He shoved the other child hard enough to send him sprawling into the gravel. The scuffle was over in seconds, pulled apart by teachers, but the consequences spread quickly. Reports were written, phone calls were made. The school administration requested a meeting. Caden's name appeared again in documents connected not to business, but to a pattern of emotional instability in the home environment. The subtext was clear. Your children are acting out what they live in. After that, pressure closed in. Inside offices with closed doors, advisors did what they did best, reduce complex human pain to simple equations. They told Caden that one variable clearly stood out: the omega. If you remove him from the picture, one consultant said, sliding a folder across the table, you can bring in a specialized team, rotating shifts, clinical approach, no emotional entanglement, no boundary issues. Children adapt, the media calms down. We can replace him, another voice added. You cannot risk your position for someone so attached. For many of them, it was easier to cut out one man than to examine the structure that had left 4 children alone with their grief for years. Elias did not sit in those meetings, but he did not need to. He felt their echoes. The manager's tight jaw, the new, careful way security watched him when he left the house on rare errands, as if measuring the distance to the gate. Snatches of phrases carried by the air when doors opened unexpectedly. Remove the omega from the equation. Back to professionals. The scent of other people's opinions seeped into the house like exhaust from the street below, sour, metallic, persistent. It stuck to curtains, to emails, to the way the cook now hesitated for a second before handing Elias an extra snack for the children. At night, he lay awake and listened to the soft breathing from the children's rooms, the occasional whimper, the small feet pattering across the hall to his door. He also listened for heavier steps that never came, the ones that would mean a suitcase, a final conversation, an exit. Beyond the gates, strangers argued over what kind of father Caden was and what kind of risk Elias represented. Inside, on the thin strip of space between rules and love, a different question grew heavier with each day. Would the man at the center of the storm choose to protect his image, or the fragile, messy family that did not fit into anyone's article? It happened on a night when the weather outside seemed determined to echo what lived inside the walls. Rain hammered the windows in dense sheets, turning the garden lights into blurred halos. Lightning split the sky into white fractures, and thunder rolled over the hill in heavy waves that made the glass tremble in its frames. For most adults, it was just a strong storm, another autumn night with bad visibility and wet roads. For the children in the Hart house, thunderstorms carried a different weight. Somewhere in their bodies, imprinted deeper than words, lay the memory that their mother had left one night in the rain and never come back. Every flash, every delayed crash of sound woke that memory, even if they could not name it. The storm had been building all evening. The children were restless at dinner, forks tapping plates, eyes flicking to the windows at each distant rumble. Elias felt the air in the house tighten the way it did before a tantrum, only this time the tantrum belonged to the sky. He stretched bedtime rituals, told one extra story, lingered a little longer by each bed. It did not stop what was coming, but it softened the edge. Near 2 a.m, when the rain was at its loudest and the thunder moved directly overhead, one of the boys woke up with a scream that tore straight through the quiet floors. A moment later, another voice joined his, then a third, then the girl's high, cracked cry. Doors banged, small feet hit the floor. They spilled into the corridor like a flock of birds chased from a tree, 4 small bodies in oversized pajamas, eyes wide and unfocused. It was not fear of monsters under the bed. It was the kind of panic that had no clear object, only a direction. Away. Away from the windows, away from the cracks of light, away from the sound that reminded them of metal twisting and glass breaking on a road they did not remember but could feel. Staff knew these nights. In the past, they had scattered, each adult trying to soothe one child at a time, pacing up and down, shushing, promising that everything was fine. By the time one calmed down, another woke again, and the cycle started over. Exhaustion built on all sides. This time, Elias moved differently. He came out of his room as the first scream still hung in the air and did not try to separate them. Instead, he called their names once, quietly, and walked to the nearest of the children's rooms. They followed as if pulled, stumbling, clutching at his shirt, their hands cold and damp. In the middle of the room, he dragged a pile of blankets and pillows into a rough circle. It was messy, imperfect, more nest than bed. He sat down on the floor inside it and opened his arms. "Here," he said. One by one, they climbed into the circle. One boy pressed himself against Elias's left side and hid his face in his shoulder. Another curled by his right hip, fingers curled in the hem of his t-shirt. The third slid down to lean against his knees, eyes glued to the ceiling every time lightning flashed. The girl pushed herself so close to his chest that he could feel her heart beating like a trapped bird. The storm outside continued its assault. Lightning flickered through the curtains, igniting pale stripes on the walls. Thunder cracked loud enough to rattle the light fixture. Each time the children jerked, muscles tensing as if ready to run. Elias's own pulse was too fast, his nerves on edge. Storms had never been kind to his body either. Too many bad memories hid in their sound. His instinct screamed at him to flinch, to crawl under something, to become small. He forced himself to do the opposite. He wrapped both arms around the two closest children and dug his back into the headboard behind him. He inhaled, slow and deep, forcing air all the way into his lungs, and exhaled just as slowly. He did it again and again. He let them feel the rhythm against their sides, under their hands. His scent, sharpened by stress, spread through the circle. Warm skin, soap, faint coffee, the distinct omega undertone that their bodies had already learned to associate with safety. It filled the small room, cutting through the metallic tang of storm-charged air. He began to talk. Not about the accident, not about death, about the rain outside their specific house on this specific night. He spoke of the trees in the garden, their roots drinking in the water, of the flowers that would open wider tomorrow because of this downpour, of how the storm moved, never staying in one place, always traveling across the sky toward other hills, other cities, growing quieter with each passing minute. His voice trembled around the edges, but he kept it steady in the center, like someone holding a rope over a chasm. He counted the seconds between lightning and thunder in his head and adjusted his timing, making sure his words slipped into the quiet spaces. Gradually, the children's attention shifted. Their eyes still flicked to the window whenever the room flashed white, but instead of searching for catastrophe, they searched for his face. When the thunder rolled, they listened for his next sentence. Their breathing, ragged and erratic at first, began to match his, in and out, a little slower each time. 4 small hearts that had been pounding in 4 different rhythms of fear started to fall into a shared pace. At some point, a shadow appeared in the doorway. Caden had woken at the first scream, lungs filling with the old familiar mix of dread and helplessness. For a moment, he stood in his own dark room, listening to the chaos with the strange, distant feeling of a man who could sign contracts worth millions, but could not stop his own children from reliving the worst night of their lives. He walked down the hallway, prepared for the usual scene. Staff hurrying past, children scattered in different rooms, someone calling his name with a request he did not know how to answer. Instead, he stopped at the children's bedroom door and saw all 4 of them in one place. They sat in the improvised nest of blankets on the floor, pressed so tightly around Elias that they seemed to form one uneven shape. Their shoulders still quivered with the aftershocks of panic, but they were no longer trying to escape. Their faces were turned toward the omega in the center, as if he were the fixed point in a spinning world. The light from the hallway caught the line of Elias's jaw, the strain in his neck as he held himself upright, refusing to curl in on his own fear. His eyes were focused on the children, not on the windows. His hands moved in slow, reassuring circles on their backs. For a long moment, Caden did not move. In his head, recent conversations replayed themselves like bad recordings. Advisors telling him to remove the omega from the equation. Lawyers reminding him of clauses that allowed him to terminate contracts at will. Voices insisting that professional teams with strict boundaries would be safer, cleaner, less messy for the public eye. None of those arguments fit what he was seeing now. Here, in this small pool of lamplight and shadow, there were no articles or board meetings or brand reputations. There were four terrified children who had chosen, without any coaching, where to run when the sky reminded them how quickly everything could be taken away. They had not run to cameras. They had not run to the staff who would eventually turn over. They had not run to him, the man whose scent they knew but whose arms they rarely found at night. They had run to the Omega, everyone else treated as a replaceable piece of staff. Caden felt something in his chest give, not with a snap, but with a long, quiet tear. The structure he had built out of recommendations, fear, and control folded under the weight of that simple reality. He thought, with a clarity that hurt, if I send him away, I am the one tearing this circle apart. He stayed in the doorway until the storm outside began to move on, the thunder rolling further away, the lightning becoming less frequent. He watched as one by one the children's heads grew heavy, eyelids drooping, bodies relaxing fully against Elias. Eventually, the Omega's own chin dipped toward his chest, sleep pulling him down even as he kept his arms around them. The house, full of cameras and rules and invisible expectations, felt different in that hour before dawn. It had seen staff come and go, had watched other nannies arrive with systems and leave with relief. It had never before held a night like this, with all four heirs of its owner wrapped around someone who stayed for reasons no contract could fully explain. After that night, the discussions about dismissing Elias did not disappear with a snap of fingers. Old habits and external pressures did not vanish, but something essential had shifted. When the suggestion was raised again in careful phrases, Caden found himself saying no, not as a strategic move, but as a fact. When partners hinted that replacing the Omega would calm the media, he thought of the way his daughter's fingers had clutched Elias's shirt and shook his head. He could find other lawyers. He could rebuild parts of his reputation. He could not manufacture the trust that had grown between his children and the man at the center of that blanket circle. On that stormy night, the house had, in its own quiet way, taken a side. Not the side of polished surfaces, tidy interviews, and easily controlled narratives, but the side of the messy, fragile bond that had become the only real shelter his children recognized. The outside world did not grow bored just because the Hart House had chosen, for one stormy night, to side with love. The article faded from the front page, but its echo lingered. New pieces appeared in smaller outlets, recycling the same phrases about an influential alpha who lets an Omega raise his heirs, about unresolved trauma in a privileged family. The story became shorthand at dinner parties and in private chats between investors, a cautionary tale about mixing emotion with power. In boardrooms far from the children's bedrooms, Caden's private life turned into a column on risk spreadsheets. At one closed meeting, the board finally dropped their careful circumlocutions. They put the question in front of him like a contract. Either he visibly put his house in order, or he accepted the possibility of losing partners and capital who demanded a flawless image. The pressure was not just on him. It pressed down on everything linked to his name. Deals stalled. A major investor requested a pause for review. Lawyers used phrases like fiduciary duty and stability optics. Every sentence carried the same subtext. Your children's chaos and that Omega's presence are now a liability. Caden stood between two roles with no neutral ground. As head of a company, he was trained to make sacrifices for the sake of the whole. As a father, he had only recently begun to admit how much he had already sacrificed without meaning to. Any choice he made now meant losing something he valued. The solution the world pushed toward him was deceptively simple. Formalize a temporary suspension of cooperation with Elias in the children's best interest. Dress it in the language of care. Say that the Omega needed rest after a period of intense stress. Announce that a specialized professional team would be brought in to support the family through a transition phase. On paper, it looked responsible. In reality, it was surrender, not to logic, but to the expectations of people who had never sat in the dark with a shaking child. The conversation with Elias happened in the office where so many decisions were made. The wide window behind Caden showed the city, clean and far away. The contract on the table between them was thick with legal phrasing, but the essence fit into a few sentences. Elias's position would be paused for an indefinite period. He would receive generous compensation, more than most nannies ever saw. He would get glowing letters of recommendation, doors quietly open to similar posts in other wealthy households. Help finding new work, if he wanted it. The text called it gratitude. Between the lines, another message pulsed. You must not come here, you must not call, you must not stand at the gate. For a while, you must become a ghost to the people who have already learned your scent as home. Caden's voice remained controlled, his eyes on the document more than on Elias's face. There were pauses where other words almost surfaced and then sank again. Elias listened, each phrase landing like a small, precise cut. He had been bracing for this since the day he signed the first contract. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he had always kept a bag half-packed in imagination, ready for the moment when the house decided he was too much or not enough. Even so, hearing the decision dressed up as concern made his throat close. Rest, they called it. To him, it sounded like exile. His heart had already reorganized itself around the rhythm of 4 small lives. Mornings meant 4 sets of footsteps, 4 different ways of saying his name. Days were measured in arguments over socks, in shared snacks, in the weight of a child's head on his shoulder. Nights ended only when the last of them stopped tossing in their sleep. Now he was being asked to walk out of that orbit voluntarily, to leave them inside a system where rules and fear of external judgment once again took priority over messy healing attachments. He signed because the alternative was forcing Caden to choose between him and the company with thousands of employees tied to it. He signed because, in a world built like this one, Omegas learned early that refusing a decision did not make it disappear, it only made the fall rougher. The children were given a softened version of the truth. They were told their nanny was going away to rest, that he had worked very hard and needed time, that other people would help for a while. The words were chosen carefully, tested on advisors and therapists. The children were no longer small enough to be fooled by tone alone. They saw the difference in Elias's eyes. The way he lingered over simple tasks, his hands a fraction slower when folding their clothes, as if memorizing the feel of every t-shirt. The way his smile froze at the edges when someone mentioned later. They reacted the way children did when faced with an unavoidable separation they could not control. They clung, bargained, rebelled in small, desperate ways. On the last day, they stuck to him like shadows. Every time he left a room, at least one followed. When he knelt to tie a shoelace, another climbed onto his back. When he sat down, someone instantly claimed his lap. One of the boys stole his watch in a clumsy act of sabotage. He slipped it off Elias's wrist when they were building a tower of blocks and hid it under his pillow, sure that without it the man would not know when to leave. Time in a child's mind was something held in objects. If you took the clock away, departure could not arrive. The girl did not scheme. She simply climbed onto his knees in the playroom and wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her face into his collarbone as if she could merge with him by force. For a long time, she refused to let go. When the manager finally came to take her for lunch, her hands slid away one finger at a time, leaving nail marks on his skin. Elias packed in the small hours of the morning when the house was quiet and the cameras saw only silhouettes. He folded his few clothes methodically into the old bag that had once carried everything he owned. The room that had become familiar in its shapes and shadows began with every item removed to revert to something anonymous. By the time he walked down the main hallway with his bag over his shoulder, the sun was low and the staff were pretending to be busy. No one met his eyes for long. The manager shook his hand with formal thanks. Security opened the gate, gaze turned outward. Elias, compelled by something he could not name, turned back before stepping into the waiting car. In the window of the children's room, 4 small silhouettes stood pressed to the glass. They did not wave. They leaned into each other, forming a single uneven line, like they had that night sitting in the circle of blankets while the storm raged outside. Now the storm was invisible, made of adult decisions and whispered opinions, but its force was no less real. He lifted his hand slowly, palm open. Slowly, One of the figures mimicked the movement, tiny hand flattening against the glass. Then the car door closed, and the house slid out of view. The apartment he returned to felt wrong from the moment he opened the door. Once, he had thought of it as a cramped but necessary shelter. Now it seemed hollow, its silence unfamiliar. The single window looked out on a street that had nothing to do with the hill, no garden, no long driveway, no shrieking laughter. His things were exactly where he had left them months ago, but they felt like props from a previous life. The bed was too big with only his own weight on it. The kettle boiled for one. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, indifferent to the fact that in another part of the city, 4 children were asking where he had gone. His phone stayed inert on the table. By the conditions of the suspension, he could not call the house, could not send messages to the staff, could not interfere with the adjustment process. The words were cold, neutral. They did not describe the feeling of holding yourself back from dialing a familiar number just to hear someone breathing on the other end. In the silence, old narratives crept back. The ones he had tried so hard to unlearn. Omegas are replaceable. Nannies come and go. You were useful until you became inconvenient. He lay in the dark and felt each of those sentences try to settle into his bones. At first, he fought them with memories. The warmth of a child's head against his chest, the look in Caden's eyes that night in the doorway, the way the house had seemed to breathe differently when they all slept in the same room. But memory offered no practical comfort. Rent was due. Bills waited. Loneliness, which he had once worn like a second skin, now felt like a fresh wound exposed to the air. The world outside the hill had demanded a separation. Contracts had been signed, optics adjusted, board members reassured. On paper, everything was under control. In 3 different places, control felt like loss. In the quiet apartment of an Omega staring at the ceiling, in a glass house on a hill where 4 children fell asleep, reaching for a scent that no longer filled their hallway, and in a high office where an alpha, for the first time, began to suspect that keeping his position in the world might have cost him the one person his family could not easily replace. Life in the Hart house without Elias revealed, faster than anyone expected, how deeply he had woven himself into its structure. On paper, the transition looked smooth. Within days, a new nanny arrived, her file thick with achievements. She had worked in ambassadorial residences, in old alpha families with strict hierarchies. Her references came from expensive schools and polished therapists. She knew how to build a schedule that could be framed and hung on a wall. Wake at one time, breakfast at another, lessons, supervised play, screen limits, bedtime routines aligned with the latest recommendations. Her voice was calm and firm, the kind that made adults nod approvingly. She logged everything into digital reports, meals eaten, minutes spent reading, instances of non-compliance. The children responded with a silence that was louder than any tantrum. They did not refuse. They dressed when told, sat at the table at the correct time, filed into the study for lessons. They answered questions with short, precise phrases. They went outside when the schedule demanded it and came back in when the whistle blew. But something essential went out of their eyes. Where there had once been bursts of wild laughter, there was now a careful, brittle politeness. Games became mechanical repetitions of what the nanny suggested. They rarely invented their own. They stopped arguing with each other as loudly, but they also stopped seeking each other's company in the same way. The house grew quieter in the wrong places. At night, the old ghosts returned. The new nanny did what she'd been taught, comforted briefly, offered water, reminded them that they were safe, then guided them firmly back to bed. She did not lie down on the floor with them. She did not stay until their breathing matched hers. That level of involvement, she believed, blurred lines. The children stopped calling for her altogether. They woke from their nightmares and lay stiff in the dark, eyes open, waiting for a scent that was no longer in the house. When it did not come, some simply stayed awake until dawn. Caden noticed the change first on the camera feeds, then in person. On the screens, his children moved like small figures in a training video, doing everything right, nothing fully. Even their fights were muted. The nanny's reports were immaculate. No major incidents, improved adherence to routine. But when he stood in the doorway to the playroom, he did not hear his daughter's high, messy laugh. He heard the safe, controlled voice of an adult leading a structured activity and the soft, unenthusiastic responses of four children who had learned that their real feelings had nowhere to go. He reminded himself why he had agreed to this arrangement. Investors appeased, board calmed, articles shifting their attention elsewhere. Everything that made up stability on paper. Then, one evening, the sky changed and undid all that careful reasoning. Rain started just after sunset, pattering at first, then building into a steady drumming on the roof. The wind picked up, pushing branches against the windows. Far off, thunder grumbled like something waking up. The children stiffened visibly. The nanny followed protocol. She closed curtains, turned on soft lights, reassured them that storms were normal. She stuck to the script, breathing exercises, counting between flashes and rumbles. On the surface, it worked. They went to bed on schedule. Around midnight, the storm intensified. Lightning strobed across the sky, turning the garden into a series of sharp black and white photographs. Thunder rolled directly overhead, shaking the glass. One of the boys sat upright in bed with a gasp. The room was too dark, too loud, too full of memories he could not name. He did not call the nanny. He swung his legs out of bed, feet hitting the floor, and ran. He ran not toward the staff wing, but toward his father's office. In the hallway, he nearly collided with his brother, then with his sister, then with the fourth of the quartet. They had all made the same choice independently, not to wake the professional in the next room, but to seek out the man behind the heavy door downstairs. They burst into the office without knocking, 4 sets of small feet on the thick carpet, 4 voices tripping over each other. Make him come back, the one who makes the storm quiet. I want Elias. Caden had been sitting at his desk, trying to read a contract while his mind replayed old decisions. The storm outside was already fraying his concentration. The sudden flood of children into the room broke it completely. He saw their faces and knew at once this was not a minor disturbance. Their eyes were wide, not with the wild panic of uncontrolled terror, but with something sharper, a plea. Not for toys, not for less school, but for the one thing he had taken from them in the name of order. These were his heirs, the people for whom he claimed to be making all his sacrifices. And here they were, shaking in his office, very clearly telling him that the professional solution he had installed was not enough. He heard his own voice, weeks earlier, in a boardroom, agreeing to temporarily restructure the home environment. He heard advisors insisting that children adapt quickly and that attachment to staff is a manageable variable. Looking at them now, he understood that for his children, Elias was not a variable. He was the difference between a thunderstorm and a nightmare. Something in him hardened in a new way, not into the old armor of control, but into a decision. At the next meeting where reputation came up, he did not wait for polite phrases. He stated clearly that the internal arrangements of his home were no longer a point for board discussion. If the presence of one Omega in his children's lives was enough to shake anyone's confidence in the company, those people were free to reconsider their involvement on strictly financial grounds. I will adjust strategy, he said. I will not negotiate my children's stability. It was the first time he had drawn a line for his family instead of his empire. When he called Elias, the Omega almost did not pick up. The phone had become, in the weeks of silence, an object of dread as much as of hope. Elias had learned to ignore unknown numbers, to flinch at the company logo when it appeared in his inbox, afraid of new clauses, new reminders of boundaries. When Caden's name lit the screen, the world seemed to tilt. He answered on the 4th ring, voice hoarse from disuse. The conversation was short in words and long in pauses. Caden did something he rarely did. He apologized without qualifiers. He admitted, in blunt terms, that removing Elias from the house had been a mistake, driven by fear of external judgment. He spoke of the children, of the storm, of 4 voices asking for one person. He did not offer the same position back with a simple, "come as you were." He offered more and, in some ways, less. On this return, Elias would not be just a nanny whose presence could be classified as staff. Legal papers would be redrawn to acknowledge his role as a co-guardian in day-to-day matters, a partner in decisions involving the children's well-being. His place in the house would be protected not only by affection, but by clauses. It was a strange, alpha way of recognizing what had already happened in practice, but it was the only language Caden truly trusted on his worst days. "Come back," he said finally, voice stripped of its usual armor. Elias sat on the edge of his narrow bed in the dim apartment, fingers digging into the fabric, and fought the urge to say no out of pure self-defense. He thought of the pain of leaving, of the silence that had followed, of the old stories about omegas being discarded. Then he thought of 4 silhouettes in a window, pressed together like they could hold each other up against the world. "I will," he answered. The next time he walked up the hill, the house looked both exactly the same and completely different. The gates opened with their usual soft hum. The garden smelled of wet grass and stone. The security guards nodded, their eyes less guarded this time. His legs shook slightly as he climbed the steps. The door opened before he reached it, the manager standing there with a look that tried to be professional and failed. Behind him, the entry hall stretched out, familiar in every line of light and shadow. For a second, time held its breath. Then, from somewhere on the upper floor, came a sound he knew better than any ringtone. One sharp cry, then another, then 2 more, braiding into a single wild chorus. "Elias!" 4 sets of feet thundered down the stairs. Whatever the new nanny had said about walking, whatever the etiquette lessons demanded, vanished. The boys reached him first, colliding with his legs hard enough to push him back a step. Little arms wrapped around his waist, his hips, his chest. The girl arrived a heartbeat later, launching herself upward. He barely had time to drop his bag and catch her before she would have knocked them all over. They clung to him in a tangle of limbs, sobs, and laughter, spilling out in messy bursts. Someone said, "You came back," over and over, as if trying to overwrite the memory of him leaving. Someone else pressed their face into his neck and inhaled, shuddering, like a person who had been holding their breath too long. Elias held them all, one arm around 2 shoulders, the other hand cupping the back of a small head. His own eyes stung. The house, with its cameras and polished floors, blurred around the edges. For a moment, the only thing that existed was the weight of 4 children and the sound of their voices. At the top of the stairs, Caden stopped and watched. He saw his children exactly as he had feared others would see them, disheveled, emotional, unguarded, showing need without shame. He saw Elias not as a risk factor, not as a line in a budget, but as the anchor none of his money could buy. There was no going back from this. No plausible story in which Elias was just an employee again, easily replaced if shareholders frowned. The children had made their choice loudly, under his roof, in full view of whoever cared to look. Caden took a slow breath and stepped down toward them, not to separate them, but to stand beside them. In that small gesture, the balance of his life shifted. He chose, openly this time, the side that would never fit comfortably into glossy articles or cautious investor memos. A family that did not match anyone's ideal scheme, but finally, stubbornly, felt real. Several years passed, and the house on the hill changed so postependent that those who lived inside almost did not notice, until one day they looked around, uvideli, što je to že drugoje mesta. There were no locked rooms anymore. The door at the end of the corridor, once a border around an old wound, now stood open most of the time. The former forbidden bedroom had turned into a quiet corner of the house, neither a shrine nor a storage space. Her clothes were mostly gone, given to charities she had supported. Some books remained, a few favorite objects, several framed photographs. The children went there without the hurried, guilty steps of intruders. Sometimes one of them slipped in alone after a difficult day, curled up in the chair by the window and sat in silence, looking at the garden through the glass their mother had once cleaned with her own hands. Sometimes they went there together, pointing at pictures, arguing over who had chewed which toy, laughing at the way their father's hair stuck up in an old snapshot. They spoke about her now, not in broken phrases overheard in hallways, but in full sentences. She liked this color. She laughed like this. She would have yelled at you for that. Sadness still lived in their voices, but it no longer carried shame. The room stopped being a locked container for pain and became a place where grief could breathe without suffocating anyone. Elias had become a fixed point in this life. On paper, he was listed as a guardian and a partner in upbringing, his name printed beside Caden's in documents that once would have included only blood relatives. His signature appeared under school forms and medical consents, on travel papers and agreements with therapists. In reality, he was the person the quadruplets sought first when something tilted. When a knee hit pavement too hard, they ran to him with bloody scrapes. When a friend had rejected them, it was his shoulder they leaned on. When tests went well, it was his praise they measured themselves by. They called him different names. One said, Papa Elias, with full seriousness, like there had never been any other pattern. Another tried L for a while, embarrassed by big words, until one day, Papa slipped out by accident and stayed. The girl alternated, depending on her age and mood, between full and short forms, but every version hummed with the same meaning. You are the one I trust. His relationship with Caden did not unfold like a romance from a book. There were no dramatic declarations under the rain, no sudden dissolving of all differences. It grew in the quiet spaces, between morning lunches, in late-night talks over half-empty mugs of tea, in the way they instinctively divided tasks without needing to ask. They learned to stand beside each other not only as Alpha and Omega, but as two men sharing the weight of 4 growing lives. When one was too tired to stay up through a child's fever, the other took over without counting hours. When a school called about a fight or a broken rule, they went together, presenting a united front, not playing at good cop and bad cop, but at honest adults who would not abandon their children even when they messed up. Warmth between them showed itself in small gestures rather than grand gestures. A hand reaching past the other to pour coffee because the night had been short. A brief touch on a shoulder as one passed behind the other in a narrow kitchen. Soft, unguarded moments on the terrace when the city below flickered and they allowed themselves to talk not about business or schedules, but about fear and hope and the versions of themselves they had once been. The external world did what it always did. It adjusted, slowly and grudgingly. Some partners had left in the first years, unable or unwilling to accept that the powerful Alpha at the head of their ventures lived openly with an Omega co-parent and did not hide it. Their names faded from email chains, their companies moved on, others came drawn by results rather than gossip. For them, it mattered that the company remained stable through turbulence, that the man in charge made decisions with a cool head and a clear sense of priorities. The fact that he now left board dinners early to make it to a school performance or refused to discuss family matters at strategy meetings became part of his reputation instead of a stain on it. The scandalous articles that once picked apart his home life were buried under newer, flashier dramas. Occasionally, a lifestyle magazine mentioned that a well-known Alpha actively participates in raising his children alongside his Omega partner. The tone was curious rather than accusatory, as if the world was slowly registering a new kind of normal. The quadruplets grew. Their mischief lost its destructive edge, trading broken vases for elaborate pranks that left everyone laughing once the initial annoyance passed. They could still turn the living room into a fortress of cushions in under 10 minutes or vanish into the garden to escape chores. But now those acts were not desperate flares for attention. They were experiments, games carried out in the safety of knowing that attention was already theirs and would not disappear if they stopped screaming. They argued more thoughtfully, too, with each other and with the adults. They challenged decisions, made clumsy but earnest speeches about justice when they felt something was unfair. Instead of shutting those protests down, Elias and Caden used them as starting points for conversations. This did not make adolescence easy, but it made it honest. Sometimes, on warm evenings, Elias stepped out onto the terrace alone. The city lay below like a sea of dim stars, each window its own small story. He rested his hands on the railing and remembered the first time he had stood outside these gates with a thin folder of documents and shaking fingers. Back then, he had accepted the job as a calculated risk, a chance to climb out of the pit of debt and exhaustion, nothing more. He had known that the house had already spat out 3 nannies and that he might be next, but he had needed the money badly enough to try. He could not have guessed that his desperate yes would strand him not at the edge of another temporary arrangement, but at the beginning of a life that refused to fit into any standard terms. He thought of the locked room, of the night the cameras watched him hold 4 sleeping children through a storm, of the empty apartment where he had first returned after being pushed out. He thought of the day those same children had run down the stairs, screaming his name so loudly it shook the dust from the corners. Behind him, inside the house, he could hear them now, older voices but still unmistakable. Someone argued over a game, someone called for help with homework. Someone laughed at something on a screen and immediately yelled for everyone else to come and see. There was no longer a sharp line between their family and his life. It had all blurred into one space, with mismatched chairs around the kitchen table, school drawings taped to walls that had once held abstract paintings, shoes scattered near the door because no system of neatly lined up pairs ever survived 4 growing bodies. If you stayed with this story until the end, remind yourself of one simple thing. Sometimes the most difficult children are not spoiled or broken. They are simply people who lost their anchor too early and are still testing whether anyone will stay if they pull hard enough. And sometimes the person who comes to them just for a salary, with a tired body and a thin contract in hand, becomes the one who returns that anchor not only to them, but to everyone under the same roof. Write in the comments whose choice in this story felt the strongest to you. Caden's, when he finally went against the world's expectations, Elias's, when he refused to run even when leaving would have been easier, or the children's, when they dared to trust an adult again after losing the first one. Do not forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you do not miss the next Forbidden BL story about how even the most chaotic life can turn into a home, if there is at least one person in it who stays.